So, if anyone remembers, you probably don't, but just in case you do, last week during the homily, we spoke about the understanding and listening, that they're two different things, really, hearing and understanding in the scriptures. And we cited King Solomon, obviously, because he's a great example of that. And lo and behold, fortuitously enough, this week, the first reading is about King Solomon and his understanding what God is saying to him. And so this is going to serve as our segue into the next thing we're going to discuss over the span of, I don't know, a week or two at least, grace. We've talked about it before a little bit, but it's good to return to these concepts, these things every once in a while, because grace occupies a central part of theology, and a proper understanding that is very important, especially when it is a subject that is either not understood at all or badly understood by many so-called online theologians. And you look at Solomon, for instance, and this is a great example of works and grace going together. See, there's this common accusation that Catholics believe their works will save them. That I was nice to Johnny, even though he's dumb, and I forgave Susie, even though she's annoying, then I got my ticket to heaven, I'm going to heaven. That's not what it has ever been. That's not what we have ever taught. Anybody who assumes that, that's severe theological arrogance, but also just bad understanding. The idea is that works and grace cooperate all the time. That one helps the other one to be more present in our lives, and then of course it's manifested. And Luther, for instance, at the beginning believed the exact same thing, but then as he gets further, he begins to fall into the idea that grace is something that no longer requires the use of human free will. And that's where the concept of once saved, always saved comes from. That once God has chosen you for heaven, you're chosen. That's it. End of discussion. Sorry though, you're going to hell because you've been chosen for that. That's one of the dangers of that is it totally discounts the use of free will. It doesn't matter whether or not I want to go to heaven at the end of the day. It's God has chosen me, and that's it. And they'll cite this reading of St. Paul we just heard as justification for that. Again, it's just bad understanding of St. Paul, because St. Paul is implying that God has called, but when someone calls, you don't necessarily have to answer, do you? No. You do answer, and those he called, he then justifies, and those he justifies, then he glorifies. It requires this response to God, this activity on my part to respond to God's call. God foreknew me, he foreknows everyone. In the scriptures, it says in the Old Testament, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. So God's foreknowledge is of all people, everywhere. And he desires all people to be saved. But the problem is that not all people want to be saved. God calls, not all respond. The 12 apostles are a perfect example of that. Perfect example. How many times did Christ turn to Judas and tell him to come back to the right road? And Judas, it says, by the end of it all, was totally shut off to Christ. As a matter of fact, the devil had entered into him by the end. He was called, did not respond. So that's the big difference. We believe that our works are a necessary part, our free will is a necessary part of the working of God's grace in my life, that God does not save me against my will. God's not going to drag me kicking and screaming to heaven. I don't want to go there. Well, you're going to heaven anyway. It's too bad. It doesn't work like that. Solomon's a perfect example of that. Before God grants him anything, what does God say? You have to ask for it. God knew what Solomon needed. But first, Solomon had to ask God. Solomon had to make the effort to put in a work of some sort in order for God to give him that grace. Ask something of me, God tells Solomon. And so Solomon does this. He prays. He makes a prayer. He puts in an effort, an action of some sort of work. His prayer is a work of sorts that he turns to God and prays. But he doesn't just pray for something for himself to gain. He also asks God to help him avoid something. If you notice that during the prayer Solomon makes to God, he prays that God help him avoid one of the mistakes that his own father made. If anybody caught that. I serve you in the midst of a people whom you have chosen, a people so vast that it cannot be numbered or counted. One of the major sins David commits is he orders a census of Israel to know exactly how many people he governs. Solomon asks God to prevent that kind of pride from being a part of his life because God knows how many people there are, and that's all that matters. So he knows what happened when David ordered the census. And that's his first request, to help me avoid making that mistake that my father made. But then he goes on to ask for something in particular, an understanding heart, not just to be nice and kind and for everybody to love you. It says, so that I can judge your people and distinguish between right and wrong. It says that's the goal of an understanding heart, to be able to make good judgments, differentiate between right and wrong. And God gives that to him. Because Solomon's request was not selfish. Again, God's grace is never meant to be a selfish thing. It's always meant to act in me and therefore increase the people that come to know God by what I am then doing, how I'm living. That's why God says, because you've asked for this, not for a long life for yourself, not for riches for yourself, not for your enemies' lives, because you asked for something like this, he says, I will give it to you. So Solomon's work, Solomon's effort to turn to God pays off. He receives this grace, and the effects of this grace are such, as long as Solomon cooperates with it, that it becomes the most glorious kingdom in the old world. Again, you keep in mind the place Solomon's coming from. He knows that he's going to be in charge of the most powerful nation on the earth at that time. Israel, David has subdued all the enemies around. It's been wars and conflicts and wars for years and years and years, and now there's finally peace, and Israel is reigning over everyone over there. People are paying tribute to Israel. That's how big the nation has gotten, how strong it has become. And Solomon's a young buck at this time, and he knows that this is not going to be an easy job, number one. But number two is if he wants to do it well, that he needs God's help, God's grace. The simplest understanding of grace is a free gift from God. That I cannot create grace. I cannot put a price tag on it. But I have to open myself up to accept it. I have to make an effort. I have to put in a work of some sort in order to receive God's grace. God wants me to have it, but I need to act. That's what it boils down to. So Solomon does this. He receives this grace, and as long as he's cooperating with this grace, what happens? It says the kingdom grows in magnificence to the point that it says people come from the ends of the world just to hear Solomon speak, just to listen to him. That's the wisdom that God gives him. It says they come to just gaze upon the glory and the riches of his court. It's more magnificent than anything they can possibly imagine. And this continues as long as Solomon is cooperating with God's grace. He made a decision. He turned to God. He prayed. He made the effort. He made sacrifices to God in the temple. Remember, after the temple's finished, the first thing Solomon does is make multiple sacrifices to God. The glory of God then dwells in the temple along with them. And everything is going along swimmingly until Solomon decides he's going to make a different decision. And he stops cooperating with God's grace. Again, God doesn't force him to keep making good decisions. Again, you notice that. God gives Solomon the opportunity to make a decision. And it says that by the time Solomon dies, there's not a single hill in Israel that does not have a shrine to a false god on it. By the time he dies, that's the choice he had then made. He turned to false gods. He turned away from the true God and went to false gods. And God says, because you've chosen to do this, the kingdom will be lost. And that's it. He stopped listening, he stopped understanding, and then he stopped cooperating. And then God's grace could not operate in his life. And he literally helps bring the entire kingdom down by that. It's never the same again. It never returns. So that reminds us of the importance of the use of free will. Now, free will and God's grace are so intimately connected in my life that one needs the other one to work. Again, God does not save me by force. Look at Adam and Eve. Okay? Tells us that in the beginning, they're enjoying perfect communion with God. They're in a perfect state of grace. That they're speaking to God. They see God face to face. It tells us Adam talks to God like one man talks to another. That's how close they are. That's the effects of this grace. And God creates this whole garden and all these animals and all these wonderful things. And there's one tree in the middle. He says, don't touch that one. Don't eat that fruit. Don't even touch it because you will die. Notice it does not say God then put an electric fence around the tree and Adam was shocked multiple times trying to take the fruit. Or Eve lost a leg when she stepped on the landmine God planted next to the tree. No, God shows him even where the tree is, remember. It says it's right there. It doesn't do not touch it. He's saying you have to make a choice to listen to me or not listen to me. He says if you choose to not, then you will experience suffering and death. And we know what they chose, how that turned out for everybody. Again, free will. Christ did not come to save a bunch of robots. He came to save human beings who in freedom want him. And that's one of the things about grace, is it's my free will opening up and asking God, making the effort to make space in my mind, heart, and soul for God's grace that I want. And then God will give it to me. But again, he needs my free will cooperation in that. It's that important. To put it in perspective, let's say an example. It's probably a bad one, but it's an example regardless. Meridian Road. I drive up and down Meridian Road, I don't know how many times every week, going from here to St. Isidore's, from St. Isidore's to here, from here to St. Isidore's, and wherever else I decide to go, which is almost nowhere besides the gas station or the auto parts. Meridian Road. I could probably drive it blindfolded by now. And I know how fast you can go at what time of day and things like that. I'm pretty good at it, I'm not going to lie. And there's that big curve down on Meridian Road, about halfway down. You notice that? Free will and grace. Brake pedal, gas pedal. You get in your car and you're going to cruise on down there. Let's say you take the brake pedal out. I'll see you on the other side of the field over there, because that's where you're going to end up. If you can't stop, you'll be in the field. That's just how it ends. If you remove one of those two, the other one is not going to operate properly. Or if you take the gas pedal out, I'll see you here when I get back, because you aren't going anywhere either. See, free will and grace always work together like that. Because I have both of those, I'm able to navigate the path that God has called me on, the twists and the turns that are there. You can't avoid them. But I can't avoid going out into the field or in the ditch. I can actually make progress too, because of free will cooperation with God's grace. They're that intimately connected. That through my free will, I can cooperate with God's grace and thus draw closer to Him and be saved. Or I can choose to not cooperate with God's grace. It really all boils down to that. And so, I should probably wrap it up now. We'll be talking for another 2 hours, and then I'll have nothing to talk about next week. So, kind of that's where we're going to stop for now. But the next couple weeks, we'll go over the different kinds of grace, as they're called, the different categories, but also how each one affects us in our concrete world, in our concrete lives today. Because again, grace is an ever-present thing that's always acting. As long as I cooperate with it, it's acting within me too. And so it's good for us to have a better understanding, a better grasp of that whole situation.